Okay, so I will say Shabbat Shalom really quick on YouTube and just let you guys know, we've already been broadcasting for about 30 minutes, but I'm just going to recap some very important elements of that broadcast because I can't just go through and repeat it all. Short version is that we have two different groups of people who are the believers in the Bible, right? Now we have the third group, right? We have Islam as a third Abrahamic group, but they don't necessarily have the Bible, the 66 books. So I'm going to address the two groups that have the 66 books. On the Jewish side, we have the translation occurring in the JPS Tanakh, and we have on the Christian side, I'll just go ahead and pull in the New American Standard Bible because I feel like that's probably the most accurate version that I've read, besides the Young's Living. But the New American Standard Bible basically is kind of the best version for somebody who's not able to read that old English style like the Young's Living translation. Now, having said all that, I think it's important to know that both sides have had their faults when it comes to translation, and both sides have had their faults when it comes to the name of God. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is basically this right here, okay? I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to look you in the eye and tell you. And I already said this in the previous broadcast before we started the YouTube broadcast. For some reason, it wasn't working right. And it is this: Yahweh is not Lord. Okay. Now, there's a reason why this is true, and I'm going to explain that. And I already kind of explained that the JPS Tanakh and the Jews have Adonai as the way the way that they address Yod He Vav He. But when you see this, when you see capital Lord, you need to understand that does not translate. Okay, I gave you the translation last session. And what's really, really, really important is however it's pronounced. I mean, just ignore that part for a minute and understand that what really needs to be understood is it's a name, not a title. It's a name. And there's big, 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 big problems with not using a name when you're a Hebrew. Big. Now, I'm going to tell you that little thread right there, that little minor piece disconnects you from relationship with your Creator. Now, having said that, I think it's very, very, very important that we also understand that there is a reason for that, and I'm going to get into that a little bit because it's very, very important that we get past the Yahweh part. When we get past the capital Lord, because we need to get past the Elohim part. And one of the things I mentioned in the prior broadcast is that they won't even say Elohim. They'll say Elohim to avoid saying Elohim because it's supposedly too holy. And I'm going to address too holy one of these days. But the bottom line is what's very, very, very important, is for us to gain an understanding that we have the commandments of God, but no Yeshua. We have the Yeshua and no commandments of God. We have error. Now, don't get me wrong. I was born Jewish. I am a Kohen. This is not an anti-Semitic message. And it's very important that people know that. But that doesn't change the fact that my brothers are in error on both sides of the aisle. Okay? Now, it is very, very important also to know that the reason why they assigned Adonai to it and eventually Hashem is not the reason why the Christians assigned Lord to it. Okay? So, instead of calling it conspiratorial, because I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you that there's some sort of satanic cabal that's trying to run the world and convince you not to have the right frequencies and not to worship your God correctly and all that stuff that the extremists of the Hebrew Roots movement do. But instead, I'm going to introduce you to error. Okay? And so here's the error. You cannot, as a king, benefit from being a king without having peasants. People who are in a state of tribute to the king are lords. Now, let me explain how this works. In its simplicity, we have basically the Saxons coming down and invading the area that we now have an understanding of is known as England. And when they do, they introduce a system to that area that was already inhabited by people that was called the feudal system. And its short version is the king had friends with him when he came down. He's just a conqueror. He's not even a king. He's just a conqueror. Okay? He's tougher than you. That's it. That's all it is. Comes in, takes it, right? But here's what's important. He steps in, and when he does, he divides up the land. His administrators divide up the land, show him the map. He looks at the map. He sees this area and says, okay, friend, here's the deal. And what had happened is all the surveyors had brought back bags of dirt, okay? And so he would commit the deed of granting title to the person who was his friend, who would then cause all of the people dwelling in that area to work in order to produce crops, mining, whatever, resources for the kingdom, but specifically for that Lord. I'm going to get to that. For that Lord, and that Lord was going to then pay tribute back to his friend the king. Okay, so the short version is this is a wolf pack, and obviously the alpha gets the spoils of the war first, right? That's the simplicity of this. And so the action of him handing that dirt to that man and titling him as landlord, okay, is what gives that lord the authority to cause the serfs or the peasants to work for him in order to be under his protection, in order to have the safety of that community be protected and not treated badly. They had to work and pay tribute to the Lord through taxes. Okay. Heavy taxes, but taxes. Okay. So now what is important is that this landlord then is the most powerful person in that land area, but he's also under the king. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we think about the word Lord, we need to think about the benefits of a king putting that word as a translational usage into the scripture, into the Torah, into the Tanakh, and into the New Testament. Right? Do you see where I'm going with this? There is a benefit for a king to say that God is a Lord. Because number one, it doesn't say he's king. The appropriate word that should have been used there, should that king had really been willing to translate with some, decency, would have been king. It should say, I am the king, your God, not I am Lord, your God. But you see how he lowered it down. Okay. Now, Some people say, "Oh, wait a minute, no, but these scholars, these translators, actually had, um, influence from the Jews, and so they were just using Adonai." No, that is not true. That is absolutely not true. These were anti-Semitic people, okay? And it's very important to understand that even though they may have known Hebrew, they knew the language, not the culture. And they knew the language, not the pictographs. And they knew the language, not the lifestyle. They knew the nuances of grammar. I know the nuances of grammar. I could walk around right now as a mainstream fundamentalist Christian, and I know the nuances of Hebrew. But that doesn't really do me any good as somebody who's seeking to try to walk out the lifestyle that Abraham, that David, that Yeshua, that the disciples walked out, which is the ancient nomadic lifestyle. So why is this so important? Because on the one side, we have the word Adonai being used, very different from the word Lord, just so you know. The word Adonai has nothing to do with a landlord. The word Adonai has to do with something else, okay? But what's really, really important to understand is that when we deal with an English Bible and we see capital L-O-R-D, that is very inappropriate. Yahweh is not Lord, he is King. And that is where your brain needs to change. If the intensification of all power in the universe really wanted us to understand the level of sovereignty that he's actually at, should he be a Lord or should he be a king? You get my drift? So do yourself a favor. Figure out what pronunciation you want to use. And every time you see L-O-R-D, capital, you know what to do. That's it for capital L-O-R-D. But I did that because of what we're about to encounter here, which is going to be Elohim, right? Okay, so let's look at this. Anoki, remember, Anoki is the humble version of I. It's the humble version of I. Anoki, Yahweh, right? I, and then what was that translation? I, the one who will observe the established existence, Elohecha, your God, right, is what's being translated there. But let's go back and let's look at this concept of Elohim. So basically, first, what we have is we have Elohim being the plural of Eloah. And Eloah is basically a name for God as well, or a title of God as well. And then we have El, which is what? It is God or godlike or mighty one, coming from El, which is a ram, okay? So let's talk a minute about how this comes about. So first of all, I think there's some very important aspects of this that are really, really not understood, and that is the level of sovereignty granted to the level of diminishing of the intensification of all power in the universe. I know that was a mouthful, but one of the things that I want you to think about is the concept of energy actually being consciousness, okay? Now, when we think about energy, this is what we got going on. And if I switch this over to the board, you can see it a little better. We've basically got the extent of our energy process, okay? We've got the extent of our energy process, and that is lightning, right? Remember the key, the kite, right? And everything that pertained to that. So Benjamin Franklin, he discovers electricity. And then, of course, we go through the whole thing of what happened with Edison and Tesla with the DC electric versus the AC electric. And I could get into how the magnetic induction generator works, but the premise is that in the end, what we are able to do is have electricity brought from miles away. Electricity. 750,000 volts. That's why when you walk under one of those high tension, high voltage power lines, you hear that buzzing because the air molecules around those wires are being charged. Okay. There's so much static electricity around those wires, and the arc from them can reach upwards of 3-4 feet. So the premise is that basically what you have going on is you have an intense amount of energy. But here's the thing, is that intelligent? Well, my answer to that is yes and no. And the reason why that's important is because you need to understand that the intensification of all power in the universe is omnipresent. Now, I know that our blessed Trinitarians have tried to kind of augment that thought process to say that omnipresent means that there's this outside of reality presence of God. But the problem with that thought process is that there's somewhere where he's not. What do we mean by that? If he's not the rock, then he's not omnipresent. If he's not the tree, he's not omnipresent. Now you can say he's in the tree, but what does that mean? Because what's in a tree? Can you find Yahweh in the tree? I can, but that's because I understand what an Elohim is. But if you go cut down a tree and you look at the tree, are you going to find him there? No, because that's the premise here. We say, God is in me. Oh, really? He is, huh? The intensification of all power in the universe is in you. Okay, now what does that mean? That means you are him. That rock is him. That pot that the flower grows in is him. The flower is him. The pollen is him. The bee is him. See, that's where the dysfunction is occurring in theologians' mind. They're trying to dichotomize, or worse, trichotomize the intensification of all power in the universe into some sort of outside of reality being and still call them omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. The intensification of all power in the universe is just that. But it is not just light flowing down a conductor. It is a consciousness. And when we deal with continuity, it is very important for you to understand consciousness. So, in that way, there's a couple very important elements that we need to talk about. The first one has to do with continuity. The second has to do with quantum entanglement. And the third has to do with reality. Okay? So the first thing that we need to talk about is continuity. You know, when I was, there was a point in time where I managed a corporation that handled installation, maintenance, repair, and manufacturing of signs. And during that time, I had an opportunity to learn some technical things. I had already known some technical things, but I learned how to use them in a very different way. There was one point in time where we had a scoreboard on the other side of a baseball field. So we had the shack where they do the scoring, and the umpires is right there, and the judges are right there, right? And then on the other side of the field, way on the other side of the baseball field, is the scoreboard, huge scoreboard. And for some reason, it wasn't working, and we were troubleshooting it. The wind had knocked it down. We stood it back up, and it wasn't working, and so we needed to figure out how to repair it. And so we were going through all these different techniques and trying to figure things out. And This wasn't working. And all of a sudden, there was this idea that maybe we should see if we can control it from the shack. And so we went over there and plugged it in and tried to see what we could see wrong. Maybe there was an LED out or something like that. And all of a sudden, what was originally maybe a wire this long that you would connect from a power source on a computer to a power source on a computer's motherboard became a baseball field of continuity where I tied two wires together, went to the other side of the field, and touched my electrodes from my multimeter to them, and actually was able to do a continuity test across a baseball field and realized we had no damage in the wires underneath the field, which was a good thing because we would have dug up the field. Continuity is very important. And the way continuity works is it is the path of least resistance. That's what continuity is. You see, if I would have registered any ohms on my multimeter, those wires are damaged. But instead, I get a clean signal, a tone that plays on my multimeter, letting me know that the wires are not damaged. How do I do that? By creating a loop. Okay. So I have the wires tied together on the scoreboard side, or on the score box side. And then I'm on the scoreboard side, touching my meter to those two wires. I'm creating a loop. And within that loop, there's a path of least resistance. And that path of least resistance registered that there's enough signal going from that box to that scoreboard. And so from that, I learned that continuity can travel a long, long distance. Why is this so important? Because one of the things that Christianity and Judaism has done with Yahweh has disconnected the continuity in theory. What do I mean by that? I mean that in the normal reality of theology, what we experience is not Yahweh. Okay? Our emotions, our thoughts, our cognitions, our actions, our choices, everything is supposedly independent of him. Now, Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being. John says, all things are held together by him, for him, and through him. Man, there's so much that we could go into with that. Colossians says something about we would not exist should he not be in us. And yet we still have this dysfunction of idea that we exist outside the realm of his existence. So continuity in its simplicity is that there is a connection from the source to the receiver, okay? So the premise is in continuity that there has to be a source. There has to be some sort of voltage. There has to be some sort of energy being produced. And then that energy is redetected in the loop, okay? So I know this is going to sound a little bit off the wall, but the short version of this is that what we are is him, and there's a direct line from us to him at all times, and that's what causes our existence. See, a lot of people think that he picked up the rabbit and put the batteries in and set it down and let it tick, right? And it kept going and going and going and going. But that's not what's true. What's true is there's a thread. There's a direct line from the intensification of all power in the universe, which is a hyper consciousness we will never understand. Right? And then that is reduced into something perceivable because it has no limitations. And that reduction occurs again and again and again and again and again and again until it's us. That means we are the intensification of all power in the universe reduced, right? That's one of our Elohim conclusions we came to when we did the Elohim series. And not only that, but a spark of that intensification of all power in the universe exists in a vessel of emptiness and voidness that then becomes defined by that energy, and then the sovereignty of that Elohim intensifies it to the extremity that it can or that it will. Now, the reason why this is so important is because you take and you fill a glass up with water, you're not experiencing a vessel of reception. And the reason why that's true is because all that's put in that glass of water is one single molecule of water, and then the glass itself intensifies the rest of the water, manifests it, emanates it, okay? And so an Elohim, I'm telling you, everything around you, every object, everything around you is an Elohim. However, there's a sovereignty to Yahweh Elohim, and there's a sovereignty to Adam Elohim. Okay? In Psalm 82, when it says, you are all gods and sons of gods, and in Luke chapter 2, verse 54, or 24, when it says, Adam was a son of God, then you need to understand that all of those are not some idiomatic, metaphorical, we're all God's children. No, you are his progeny because he's an emanating thing. He is pulsating out something all the time. And that something is becoming us at this lower level of corruption. Why do I say corruption? Because there is a major reduction in light at this level. Okay? And we are working on elevation. We're trying to move out of this corruption, right? Corruption must put on incorruption. Mortality must put on immortality. And if you really want to, start something in the comments, immortality does not occur in one lifetime. Okay, so having said all that, continuity is a loop initiated by the intensification of all power in the universe. And so that means there's a return. There's a return from us to it. So one of the most important parts of this is that there's a feedback to it. Now, I'm not going to get into what all that means because we could get into, well, that's prayer, right? But also there's another element of it that is important, and that is Yeshua. He says to a group of disciples, and I think some other listeners, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink, right? I was in prison and you visited me. I was sick and you comforted me, or maybe it's vice versa on those, etc. And they say, Lord, when would we do those things? And he says, if you have done it to the least of these, you have done it to me. And he tells Judas, the poor is always with you. You will always have the poor with you, right? And then there's a place in Deuteronomy that says you shall have no poor among you, right? But then there's a part down below that says take care of the poor. In other words, we're supposed to strive towards this goal by doing this thing. But what are the poor? They're receivers. They're receivers. And we are the greater, those of us who aren't poor, I should say. Those of us who are not poor, and those of us who have the wealth to distribute to the poor willingly, freely, joyfully, right? Generously. And what happens? That distribution to the poor is that full loop. Now you say, well, how is that? Well, because he said, if the widows and orphans or the poor cry out to me, I will exile you from the land. The land will vomit you out, spew you out. And his complaint in Ezekiel 22, where we have corrupt priests, corrupt princes, lords, and corrupt prophets is the exploitation of the poor, exploitation of the widows, orphans, and poor. Okay. Now, the intrigue of that is going to come in the form of understanding that the poor is a vessel of reception, which means what? They're being given a spark. If they actually intensify that spark, they won't be poor anymore. That's a whole nother story. But you see now how this works, that the loop does not go down to you and then back up, but the loop circles down more. If you are in a higher economic status, physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially, or cognitively, mentally, you are a greater, and that means there's a lesser who needs you. And that's how it loops down, because if they cry out, it's the opposite feedback going back up, which means what? There's been resistance and continuity has been broken. Now, there's an intrigue to that. There's an intrigue to that, because if you think about it, let's say that we have some sort of electronic, maybe a flat screen TV, something like that. Okay. It doesn't work. You push the power, it doesn't turn on. What is that? That's a broken circuit. That's a broken loop. That's a broken continuity. It still exists. It's still a TV. It still has everything that would explain it to be a TV, except for one thing. It is in a state of dysfunction. And dysfunction means that the thing exists, but it is not operating in the natural order processes and the cycles in which it was assigned. So we could get all into the Hebrew here, right? Because what do we got? We got Lord, which makes sense. I mean, in the sense of Elohim being a covenant maker, right? Eloah means a covenant maker. How do we know that? Because there was only one sovereign in the nomadic camp who was allowed to negotiate covenant with a lesser, or with a greater for that matter. There was only one. It was not a democracy. It was not a presidency. It was none of those things. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't a dictatorship, but that's a different story. It was the sovereignty of the clan leader to be able to make covenant. So Yahweh is aptly named an Elohim because of that action of covenant. But you need to remember that drawing, and I guess we are going to have to go to the board, which we'll do right now. And so what do we have? We have the lead ox, right? And we have the shepherd's crook. That is pronounced El. And that is the concept of strong authority. But I want you to think about this. What do we see in history of, say, the Viking conquerors? Which, if you really want to get crazy with that, look at the history of the Scandinavians and Google with that something along the lines of the tribe of Dan and see what you see. But the premise is that these Vikings come along, and what do they have? They have horns on their head, right? They have horns that they wear on their head to designate that they are the authority, to designate that they are the sovereign. Why is that so important? Because that same premise goes throughout history. We see it in many, 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 many cultures, and we even see it in the Hittites, which consequently, was it the Hittites? I don't know. It's one of the Canaanite tribes had evidence of wearing horns on their head. Because why? That's an Eloah. That's a sovereign clan leader. Why is it so important? Because we can see how the action of Lord could have came about here from a lack of understanding in the metaphysical, esoteric, and mystical elements of the word El. And here we are, these ancient Hebrews attributing that word to the intensification of all power in the universe. Why is that so important? Because when we get into the thought process of Elohim, we instantaneously want to assign the word God. Why? Because that's what it says in the English. And that, unfortunately, is the mistake. Because why? Because God doesn't justify that word correctly. What Yahweh is saying here is, I am the one who will observe your existence, your Elohim. What does that mean? Your power. Your existence is going to come from him and be your power. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the vitality of energy, or the energy of vitality that causes you to be alive, is actually threaded to the intensification of all power in the universe through continuity. Now, there's a reason why that's so important. Because the first thing that happens when the intensification of all power in the universe decides to create is it creates her, a feminine principle, a vessel of reception, able to receive. And then he creates a masculine principle. He creates him. It creates him. And the him becomes the answer to the vessel of reception, the masculine and feminine principle. But here's the crazy part. The first perceivable limitation that the intensification of all power in the universe puts on itself as a consciousness is a masculine principle, a him. And that masculine principle has no answer to the feminine principle. And that masculine principle goes out in all directions trying to do what masculine principles do. And there's no answer, because it is not good for man to be alone. Did you guys know that's a commandment? Did you guys know that's actually one of the 10 utterances of creation? That part of creation was that statement? Did you guys know that that process of aloneness occurs first as Yahweh becomes the perceivable God? Now, why is that so important? Because when we get into the function of the balance between the masculine and feminine principles becoming one and becoming a balanced being, we get to Yeshua. We get to Yeshua. Because Yeshua was a balance between judgment and mercy, a balance between the sovereignty of a conquering king, or the sovereignty of a conquering king and the gentleness of humility. All stuffed into something that we could actually understand. And then when we started corrupting its process, it comes down and sets the example. He shows us how to use Torah to be merciful, not extreme. He shows us how to use Torah to enjoy our life. You know, that's one of the things that has blown my mind in the offspring of Jerry B. Jenkins and you know, the Left Behind series, right? The offspring of the Left Behind series, so to speak, and all of its artistic liberties. One of the things that I love about The Chosen is that fact that they have these life problems and they still keep Torah. They're walking out Torah. And it is not the problem. It is not the law that is causing the problem in their lives. It's not. Nowhere in any of those episodes does it indicate that the Torah was the problem, right? Politics, corruption, other things were the problem. I think that's beautiful. Because the truth is that the Torah, when it didn't have the function in us humans of rightness, became flesh and dwelt among us as a balance of all of the attributes of Yahweh, Elohim. Still an Elohim itself, just as us. He says that in John 10. You miss it. You miss that he flat out says it. But somewhere along the lines, that Elohim has a sovereignty to it at every level. So I, as an Elohim, have a sovereignty. I am a sovereign God, as it were, if you wanted to get crazy with those words. But I am a sovereign Elohim. I have a free will, and I am a Lord. I am a Lord of Aretz, of earth. The sons of Adam are rulers of earth, right? And if I am willing to elevate, vibrate at a higher energy, then I am also a Lord of heaven. Not king of heaven. Not king, but Lord. And here's the absolute amazing part of this. Even a rock is an Elohim. A Lord at its level is an Elohim. If you can accept it. If you can accept that. And that's going to become very important in the days to come. But I think one of the more extreme elements of this whole thing is that idea of continuity. Because what is actually coming down from the intensification of all power in the universe? Information. Is it coming down in some linear thread of process? No. It's going out in all directions and then being interpreted by the consciousnesses of the various Elohim. Now, what will really get crazy is when you realize that all of this is actually particle physics. I said the second thing was quantum entanglement. So there's this process in quantum entanglement. I'm going to go ahead and draw it on the board for you. So the principle is that let's say that we have let's just call this a tube. Okay. And right here, there is a splitter. And so somebody shoots particle down this thing. And then the tube goes two different directions. Let's see. Let's do this. So the principle is that when that particle hits this splitter, one piece of the particle goes this way as a particle, and one piece of the particle goes this way as a particle. In other words, there are two new particles. Now, what scientists discovered is that these particles have spin, okay? And so I'm going to illustrate spin by just putting an arrow in a certain direction, okay? So this one is spinning upward, okay? Or spinning on that axis, so to speak. And what they found is that the other particle will always be the opposite direction. Now, what's crazy about this is that there is an infinite amount of time and length that can separate these two particles, and they will still know what the other one is spinning at. They have set up all kinds of detection to figure out how this works. Now there's two very important elements here. But the concept is that if this one is doing this, then this one is doing this. And if this one changes direction, this one changes direction. So if you have a particle here, if you have a particle here, right, and it is spinning upwards, then the particle here will always be spinning downwards. But if this switches, okay, and spins downward, then we have a different situation altogether. But here's the crazy part. Even though we have a very different situation, and when I say different situation, has to do with matter and whatnot. But the premise is that basically we have a change on the other side of the universe. This has to do with continuity, something that basically the physicists can't really explain why it exists. They understand it does, and there's some other very important elements. For example, if they observe the particle spinning in a certain direction, it will always be their expectation, right? And there's only one thing in the universe that can control that spin, and that's us. And you could watch quantum physics videos or quantum mechanics videos all day long, and eventually you're going to find that every single one of them asks this question: why do the detectors know that we want the particle to spin in a certain direction? We don't know. That remains to be known. Every single last particle physicist will tell you they don't know. In some way, they'll say they don't know, because they don't. Now, the reason why that's so important is because the other one, right? So if this one is spinning, this one will spin the opposite direction. So if we expect this one to spin in a certain direction, guess what this one's going to do? And so the reason why that's so important is because that continuity demonstrates that energy can be affected by information over time and space in an instant. In an instant. It totally proves, if there was ever an experiment in the history of atheist physics professors that could prove that there was a God, this is it. But the reason why they don't believe there's a God, because they're still mad at the concept of Sky Daddy instead of the concept of Yahweh Elohim. You get that? Don't get me wrong. There is an entity of consciousness outside of our understanding, but not outside of our existence. That's very important, because that consciousness is directly connected into us, and those processes of instruction and that process of sovereignty and that process of clan leader is working inside of us as a intuition. If the Gentile, though not having the law, what is the law? Teaching and instruction from where? From the intensification of all power in the universe, emanating from it. Not that it was sent out as a package. We got the package, we look at the package, and that's nice, but instead a constant thread of information emanating from the intensification of all power in the universe into us, Elohim, who are creators. Even that rock is a creator, okay? That's very important for you to know, that even a rock is a creator. When you experience the concept of minerals growing, you are understanding they are obeying a natural order process instruction and creating. Therefore, they're sovereign. and they're making the choice to be obedient to the instruction of that natural order process. Things that violate that natural order process are in a state of dysfunction, and most of the time are destructive, which says a lot about our brains. So, I am Yahweh Elohecha. Anochi Yahweh Elohecha. Let's look at it. Anochi Yahweh Elohecha. Why does he say, I am your Elohim? Ani Yahweh Elohecha. I humbly will observe the existence, the established existence of your powers. Okay, let's keep going. Asher. Okay, so Asher is basically, and I know I mentioned, let me say this real quick. I know I mentioned three things that have to do with our Elohim teaching today, and I only mentioned two. We're just going to stop on that second one. Asher is an interesting word. Okay? So it's basically a relative particle. Now, in English, we use the word which, right? W-I-C-H, which. So that which, we use the word that, right? We can use the word is or are or was, but it's not as prominent of a relative particle. Now, the reason why this is so important is because it's just a word to express the dependent part of the clause. Remember, which has a comma in it, right? So the comma creates a dependent clause. And so in Hebrew, when we want a dependent clause, we establish that. What's a dependent clause? A dependent clause is something that is dependent on the rest of the sentence, okay? Now, the reason why this is so important is because, like, for example, if I say, if I use an if statement, so if I say something like, if I go to the park when it is raining, comma, I will get wet. That comma is the word asher, okay? And so the way that I want you to think about this is that it's kind of like, it's a way to say that the rest of what I'm about to say is dependent upon what I just said. Okay, that's the premise of the word asher. So don't get too caught up in asher, because remember, ehya, asher, ehya is I am that I am. And that is a horrible translation, as you now know. But the premise is that asher has still an element of existence as a pictograph. Okay? So we're going to go look at that. And I think that's important because, again, we are dealing with ancient pictographic Hebrew here. Okay? So I'm going to copy my number, go over to the Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible. This is the digital version, so it's a little bit different from the paperback version. Take out the H because obviously we're only working with Hebrew words. So there's no H in the Strong's Concordance numbers that are enumerated in the lexicon. And then we are going to go to our number. And you see that it technically is translated which. Definition, who or what or that. This word links the action of the sentence to the one doing the action, as a rope attaches two objects together. Okay, so let's see what we got here. Let's go back to our parent root. So the actual concrete word is cord, okay? Cord. And the actual action is to tie, and the abstract is prosperity, okay, or happiness. You say, how is that possible? Well, let's talk about it. The pictograph sheen is a picture of the teeth representing pressure. The resh is a picture of the head representing the top or beginning. Combine these mean press the beginning. That's the concept here. Press the beginning. Okay, let's talk a minute about this. Isn't there some intrigue to this concept of press the beginning? And here's the interesting thing is, are we really talking about beginning here? Remember, there's a concept in the Hebrew grammar of the first verse of the Bible that beginning is a name, not a title, not a noun, but instead is a name that means source, right? So if we're pressing to the beginning, we're somehow trying to connect continuity to the beginning, right? Okay, so let's go back into our definition now. Ropes and cords were usually made of bark strips, such as from cedar or from sinew, tendon of an animal. The rope is made by twisting two fibers together. A single fiber is attached to a fixed point, top, and the two ends of fiber are brought together. One fiber is twisted in a clockwise direction and wrapped over the other fiber in counterclockwise direction. The second fiber is then twisted in clockwise direction, then wrapped around the first fiber in the counterclockwise direction. This process is repeated through the length of the rope. The twisting of the fibers in opposite directions causes the fibers to lock or press onto each other, making a stronger rope. The rope is used to tightly secure or support something such as a load to a cart or the poles of the tent. Now, next we have sinews, right? Sinews were used for the making of cords by twisting them together, the umbilical cord and the navel as cords that binds the infant to the mother or the life to the source, right? Bracelet, a cord that twists around the wrist, right? Wall as an encircling city, right? Remember our word for grace, that circle of grace. Okay. And then we have juice as loosened from the fruit. Okay. Because if there's a pressing of the fruit to expose the juice. And we have the word wall again. We have harness, right? Or armor made from tightly wound cords of leather. Sinews used for making cords by twisting them together. The umbilical cord as the navel as the cord binds the infant to the mother. We saw that already. And then we have this idea of enemy as one who is tied up by a rope, right? Navel, which is what? The connection to the belly button or to the cord itself, right? Imagination, a twisting together of thoughts. And then we have the child root asher. A cord is pulled tight and is straight. Okay? So, looking back at our word, I'm not going to spend too much time here. We have the concept of asher being as two ropes attached two objects together. So, asher is kind of a joiner, as it were. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if you're reading Hebrew, I think it would behoove you to know that when this letter is connected, that means that there is two separate things that need to be brought together and connected. Now, in Hebrew logic, that can be very easy, and in linear logic, that can be very difficult. All right, so having said that, we move on to our next word, which is going to be yatzah. Yatzah. Now, this is an interesting child root because it has an aleph and a yod, meaning what? Meaning that we have to drop one of them. We don't know which one. So let's just go ahead and use our lexicon at this point. I mean, I know which one, but let's use our lexicon at this point and we'll talk a little bit about this word. Okay. And so the premise is that we're working with to go forth or come out. Okay. To go forth or come out or to go out. So let's go to our parent root, which is going to be Sadi Aleph. Go ahead and mark these real quick so we know. So here's an interesting thing here. It's excrement or to go out. And notice there's no pictograph definition. We can talk about that maybe in a minute. But let's look at this. Sadi is a picture of a man lying down or squatting to issue out of something. This parent root is related to the Sadi Yod and the Sadi Hey. Okay. In this sense, and remember, there's some sort of malfunction in this program, and it doesn't give the Hebrew letters here. Okay. So Sadi Yod, in the sense of issuing out of a man, excrement, offspring. Okay. What issues out of a generation? Filthy as something that is soiled with excrement again, and issuing out of one place to another. Go out or come in or to issue forth. A going out. Coming or issuing out, such as words or from the mouth. Origin, as in the history of where something issued from. So, this is going to sound kind of off the wall, but the premise is that something issues out of somebody, right? Everybody knows it's coming out the backside. You have to go number one, right? That's the premise here. Sweat, right? All issuing out. What does that interpret into for a energy consciousness at the center of the entire existence of reality? Not just the universe, but the center of existence of reality. The very existence of reality is actually an emanation or an issuing forth, an outgoing. So there's that continuity again. But here's the intrigue. How is this word being used in this context? It is in the hifil, okay? The hifil. Now, that is a very, very important thing because the hifil expresses causative action of the cowl. I'll explain the cowl in a minute. So hifil is often used to form verbs from nouns and adjectives. So I think the important thing here is that it says it caused you to issue forth. Okay? Caused you to issue forth. And then the next thing is from the land. We're not going to get too much into the word land, but let's talk about it for just a moment. The concept of land comes from a pottery shard that messages were written on from sovereigns sent by agents or messengers to other sovereigns or to lords or commanders that were agents of that sovereign. So the concept is the word ratz, resh tzadi, means to run. And it comes from the idea of a man crouched down who has been running as a result of hiding from an enemy. And so that word also doubles as the word ambush. It doubles as a bunch of other concepts of hiding in the crag of a rock, right? To hide from the enemy, so to speak, or to lie in ambush as the enemy comes by. Okay. So the premise is man lying down. However, the concept is agency being communicated through information, right? And that agency being a message from a sovereign to some other sovereign or lord or commander. So, for example, the king would send a messenger out to talk with the commander of the army or something like that. But the premise is that that's where the runner treads. And so once you add the aleph in and it becomes aretz, it's that place which is tread. Okay, that's what the word land or earth, the earth was without form and void. No, the land was without form and void, or the place that was tread was without form and void. We get in all kinds of weird stuff with that, can't we? But the premise is now what we need to get our minds wrapped around is that the land is not necessarily the dirt on the ground, but instead a place in which agency has tread. Okay. Now, the next word we know it's Mitzrayim. It's Egypt. And what did it mean in our studies before? Limitations. So literally what this says is, I am humbly the one who will observe, remember it's in the imperfect, who will observe established existence of your powers, which issued you forth, caused you to issue forth from limitations from, and we're going to get to this next word now, from the house of, or bayit, or beit, right here, from the house of avodim. What an interesting word avodim is. Let's take a look at avodim. Avodim comes from the Hebrew word eved, a slave or servant. Now, we'll talk about that in a minute, but then we need to look at the word avad. Avad means to work. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this. I'm pretty sure that this is going to be an adopted root, and we're not going to explore the depth of that adopted root today, I don't think. We'll see. Maybe we will. It depends on the intrigue. If we have to, we will. Okay. So getting into the actual ancient pictographic Hebrew, avad means servant or one who provides service to another as a slave, bondservant, or hired hand. Okay? But I'm going to propose to you that they actually all mean the same thing. A worker. Okay? But let's see, do we get the opportunity for this to be... No, we do not. Okay. So, avad. Now, why is it following Shin Tav or Samik Resh? Because it is an ayin and not a ga. So if we were to go in and try to kind of understand it, it would be someone who is observed working, right? Because it has the I instead of the twisted rope. Someone who is observed working. But if you really look at this, it gets more intriguing. So let's go ahead and we will actually look at the we'll go ahead and try to find the parent root here. So we need to go into this one. And what we need to do is, oh good, we're in, oh no, that's the ga. We are actually, okay, so ayin bet is one of our options. In fact, let's document this on the board real quick, just to stay on task here. Okay, so here's the principle is you have the ayin bet dalet, okay? So our options are to go from here to here, right? So our first one would be ayin bet, okay? Our second option would be to go from here to here, which would be ayin dalet, okay? Our third option would be to go from here to here, which is going to be bet dalet, okay? All right, so we need to go find out the these. So we'll start with ayin dalet, experience back and forth, or witness. Okay, so for that one, we will go ahead and write witness on the board. That is this one, witness. Okay, and then the next one would be going to be ayin bet, which it doesn't look like we're going to have an ayin bet. Let's see. No. Oh yeah, there it is. Experienced the tent or dark cover. The tent is made of a covering of thick and heavy or black or dark goat hair. Okay, so let's go back over to ayin bait, and it looks like we may be using the ga here. I don't know. Let's see. So this is going to be dark cover. Or experience the tent. And then Beit Dalet, that's in another area. We'll have to run over there real quick. Go all the way across the lexicon here. Unfortunately, because these are actually drawings here, right? Because those are drawings, I can't just search for it. So we have to kind of navigate through here, which I'm sure just looks wonderful on screen. So I apologize for that, but it's the only way to really get here. All right, so we are going to be at Beit Dalet. There we go. All right, and that is going to be tent door or separate. Tent door or separate. Okay. So we're not getting a whole lot of love here, right? This doesn't sound like a worker at all. But let's see if we can keep going with it. And let's try it this way. Let's go in and do the pictographs. So in this case, it's the ayin, right? I don't want to use that color. I want to use a different color. So in this case, it's the ayin, right? The beit. That was horrible. I want much better, but all right. And then, of course, the tent door, right? And so what do we have here? We have see or observe the tent door. Or we could have this be movement, right? And this can be experience. Okay, so I'm going to move in the direction to say that our best parent root is going to be experience the tent. However, I'm also tempted to use the word separate. And I'm going to tell you why. This is a hard one. I like a good challenge. The reason why is because a servant would be sent outside to work, right? And so they would be separate from the tent. A servant would be sent outside to work the crops, to tend to the animals. But some servants would be inside, so experience the tent could be there too. But I'm leaning towards separate. I'm leaning towards separate, which means observe the separate one, right? The one who is separated from the clan as a worker, not a member of the clan. Now, there's a number of reasons how that's possible. The first, of course, is in its simplicity, somebody who's been hired to work the land or work the crops, right? Or assist in the tent. The second is going to be an indentured servant, which is basically someone who either has refused to pay tribute or someone who has basically entered into debt in some way. Okay. And of course, the sovereign or the clan leader would then have ownership of the person's time, right? Ownership of the person's time in terms of production of crops or the, say, shearing of sheep or whatever. Either way, the premise is that that debt could be sold and then that person would have to go work for another person. What it is not, and this is important, it is not chattel slavery. It is not ownership of a human. You have to understand Torah to understand the Hebrew people. And remember, Abraham was obedient to Yahweh's covenant in all ways. Okay? So when we're dealing with the ancient nomads, yes, did the Canaanites have actual slaves, chattel slavery? Yep, absolutely. They would go in, ransack a city, take somebody, make them work for them, and never, ever release them. But that's not what Torah commands, is it? No. And not only that, but after a debt is paid, the servant was treated so well, they have the opportunity to have the all put through their ear. Okay? So spare me the chattel slavery arguments. Now, here's the premise. So I'm going to lean in the direction of separate. So let's go back and take a look at that definition. The father of the tent often sat alone at the door of the tent. Here he could receive shade from the sun, watch over his household, and watch the road for approaching strangers. Many things are separated from the whole. A branch is separated from the tree. A thread is separated from the cloth. A liar is separated from the family or causes a separation in the family because of his false words. A wanderer is one alone or lost. A place separated from people is a place of ruin. A liar is separated from the family or causes a separation in the family because of his false words. I don't know why they repeated that. Now, what we have here is the entire world of this first commandment, right? Humble, I humbly will observe the established existence of your powers, right? The established existence of your sovereignty. I will humbly observe that, which I caused you to be delivered from. No, I caused you to issue forth from your limitations and your indebtedness. Don't think for a second that Israel was immune from the concept of indebtedness to Pharaoh in Egypt. I realize that we could really, really get into an argument here as to whether they were chattel slaves or they were indentured servants. But when you go back and read the Hebrew, something very, very intriguing happens where we do not see coercion in the Hebrew. That's a whole nother story. Doesn't mean they didn't need deliverance. It doesn't mean they didn't need a kinsman redeemer to come and bring them out of the house of indentured service. And not only that, but the concept here is the limitations, right? I brought you out of the place that was tread of limitations. I caused you to issue forth from the place that was tread of limitations and the house of slavery. Now we could get into that word house real quick. I would like to actually. And then after that we can be close to being done. But and then we'll have completed the first commandment. And by the way, for those of you who have not yet, go look at the 10 Commandments on a city hall lawn or in front of a church and tell me if this is the first commandment or not. Okay. All right, here we go. So what we're going to do then is we'll jump in and we'll get our Strong's Concordance number on the word bayit. Okay. (1004), huh? Go back into our ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. So our parent root, where are we at? There we are. Parent root is going to be Beit Tav, right? And the action is to lodge, right? The concrete is house. And there is no abstract, although there is a huge abstract, isn't there? There's the vessel of reception. All right, here we go. The pictograph, let me go ahead and highlight that definition here real quick. The pictograph bait is a tent or house. The kav is two cross sticks, meaning a mark or sign. The family mark is the name of the patriarch of the family, such as the house of Jacob. The primary function of the tent is to provide a protection and a sleeping area at night. Okay, so obviously it's tent, right? It's vessel. It's actual family. Go ahead and mark that. Family. It's actually family. Okay. But what is a family? Because not all Israel is Israel, is it? No. Only the children of promise are the sons of God. Okay. So in that way, now what we need to do is ask the question, what is so important about the letter Tav and the bait being together to indicate that that's a tent? Well, interestingly enough, the letter Tav doubles as the word covenant. And the reason it does is because, again, in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, remember, like the word for unclean is actually the drawing of a container of water, saying, here's your solution for being unclean. So there's word associations with the ancient pictographic Hebrew. And here we have the ancient pictographic Hebrew representing the two cross sticks that represent the name of the clan, right? They would hang the banner on the two cross sticks, and that would claim the spot where they were going to pitch the clan, right? And if somebody had a problem with that, they could challenge them. But oftentimes what would happen is covenant would be made. I won't tread on your land. You won't tread on mine. I won't take your property. You won't take mine. If there's a war, I'll back you. If there's a war, you back me. And so the premise is then that becomes a covenant, right? And so the Tav represented that idea of covenant. Also, the instruction of the clan leader or sovereign had its thought process in covenant, in relational commonality with the rest of the family. Remember, there was no democracy. The clan leader was the sovereign. And so the reason why that's so important is because then when we get into the concept of house, we could also say that it is the indentured service of your ancestors. Remember, I visit on the children to the third and fourth generation, the sins of the fathers. And the focus and the concept of there being epigenetic information saying that that this sin would be a function of my life. If I overcome it, right? If I overcome it, then I am actually starting a new generation of those who love God, right? Because if you love God, you will keep his commandments. Okay. Although we don't really understand love, that's okay. Okay. So what do we have? We have, I am the Lord God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of slavery. But in the Hebrew, I humbly will observe the established existence of your powers, which I issued forth from the limitations and from the house of indentured service, or from the house of debt. What a powerful, powerful, powerful verse. So let's summarize some things. First of all, at the beginning of this broadcast, before the YouTube channel got jacked up, I mentioned that I had a real problem with the way the Hebrews or the Jews translated things, and a real problem with the way the Christians translated things, because they have agendas. Do I have an agenda? I think we all do. I think no matter what, there's going to be some translational bias. However, the pictographs don't lie. And although you can see how the pictographs had numerous references to the same things in different ways, generally speaking, we have a concrete form of a pictograph, right? The reason this is important is because I know some people would say, well, Rabbi Q, your interpretations don't line up with people who have been to college for 8 years and studied the Bible. I get that. I want you to understand, you take this or you leave it. But if you hear your shepherd's voice and you blow it off, I'm not responsible. I gave you the information. You need to understand. You continue to use the word Lord. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are times when I forget, and I'll say it because I was a Christian for a long time and I was conditioned to say that word. But if you choose that word instead of the name, and you have an understanding of that name now and choose to still say I am, or to still say Lord, or any of those things, that's not good. Now, if you don't hear your shepherd's voice in this, if this doesn't show that type of sovereignty of communication from the intensification of all power in the universe. But I would be concerned if I was you. If you have and you continue to do what you've done before, then you will get what you've gotten before. But if you want to move in a direction of something different, and I'm going to explain this, it is the majority. And you go back and learn about what majority means in Talmud, or go back and learn what majority means at Nicaea. It is the majority who are deciding how you should hear the words of the Bible. And last time I checked, broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many there are who find it. So the minority, the group that's in those councils saying, hey, guys, we can't go this direction, you might want to see what they had to say. Because narrow is the way. Every time I see a majority vote in theology, a consensus of Christian doctors, a consensus of theologians, I wince. Every time I read the story about how even heaven answered, and the rabbi said it's up to us as the majority. The majority will overrule even heaven, which is consequently kind of true in the sense of who we are as Elohim, but not kings, right? But amen. Still, the majority will rule, right? And that's why Talmud exists. That's why all of the things that have gone on with our brothers in Judaism exists. That's why there's such a dichotomy between Christianity and Judaism. There's such a separation. A rabbi accepts Christianity and says, there's no way you all serve the same God we serve. A Christian will look at a Jew and say, there's no way you serve the same God I serve. And that's because there's a middle ground of the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God. Revelation 12:17. And why is that so important? It's important because when we get into the concept of the idea that we're in a battle and that there's an enemy, and that enemy is trying to do something to you, he's not interested in those who only have the commandments of God. He's not interested in those who only have the testimony of Yeshua. It is very important to understand David was a New Testament saint. David knew his Messiah. Abraham knew his Messiah. Abimelech knew his Messiah. Lord, no, not Lord, Yahweh, will you destroy a sovereign nation? Right? Telling you, it is so important for us to look deeper. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to get you to listen to me and learn from me. I'm trying to get you to understand how to look and see these things. So please understand, I've got Christian friends, I've got Jewish friends, I've got people in between, I've got atheist friends, I've got agnostic friends. All I'm trying to show you is that there's a connection between the reality that is in front of us that we continue to try to separate God from in our minds, and the reality that it actually exists in the universe as the intensification of all power in the universe, a consciousness that is actually made up of everything that exists. So, what did we learn today? We learned continuity. We learned that it is not wind-up toys. There are threads connected to you, to me, to the rock, to the tire on the vehicle, to the tree, to the flower, to the bee that emanates at all times in specific pulsations and oscillations from the intensification of all power in the universe that is a consciousness. Shabbat Shalom.